Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, The Security of Applications Supporting the New Remote Lifestyle, brought to you by Synopsys. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters. Lisa Brinkleson is a Senior Product Manager for the Black Duck Binary Analysis and Black Duck Legacy Products, Protex and Code Center. She has been with Synopsys, formerly Black Duck Software, for about 9 years. Starting as a Senior Tech Support Engineer for the Black Duck Suite products, she joined the product management team 7 years ago, bringing along a good knowledge of customer pain points in open source market. Prior to Synopsys, she was an IT professional with over 10 years experience in various technology environments and various roles, from developer to technical account manager for companies like Adobe and Sybase. Mike Mcguire is a product marketing manager at Synopsys, where he is focused mainly on Black Duck software composition analysis tools and audit services. After beginning his career as a software engineer, Mike transitioned into product management and marketing roles, as he enjoyed interfacing with buyers and users of the products he worked on. Leveraging several years of development experience, Mike enjoys connecting the market's complex AppSec problems with Synopsys' comprehensive solutions. And with that, I'll pass it off to the speakers.
All right, thank you so much, Lucy, and thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar. This is what we consider to be a pretty exciting and unique topic to be talking about here. So without any further ado, let's dive right in and start off with a tiny bit of an agenda to set the scope of today's talk. So before we really get into findings, we thought it'd be nice to go over what led to us deciding to embark on this type of study, which types of apps we chose to analyze, how we picked them, why we decided to analyze those applications in particular, and so forth, the methods that we use to go about analyzing these applications, and then, of course, the findings that we uncovered in analyzing these applications for security defects and vulnerabilities, and what these findings mean for developers, development teams, security teams, and software development organizations, and also the consumers of applications as well. So our first topic, like I said, why did we decide to go about this study? And as everybody knows, it's pretty hard to not realize this, is early in 2020, the COVID shutdowns and lockdowns began, right? So what started off as a few week promise just to slow the spread of the coronavirus, we have actually gotten well over a year, maybe a year and a half into those shutdowns, with some different jurisdictions opening up in different capacities. But I think we all are still experiencing some sort of shutdowns. But in the beginning, everybody was really forced into a very remote lifestyle. Working, learning, shopping, everything had to be done remotely, not in person, to limit contact, and mostly from home. Now, there's a lot of slack to be picked up in order to support this, and a lot of the slack was picked up by web applications and desktop applications, but also mobile applications, right? Cell phones and tablets, especially tablets. Tablets nowadays acting more and more like desktop computers, but they're still leveraging a mobile interface. They're still leveraging mobile applications. And this makes sense, right? Considering how applications are used and how they're targeted, right? Mobile applications, they respond to society's demand for speed. We want something when we want something, we want it now. We really don't want to have to wait around for it. And also, applications are able to connect a business or a service to their user via the device that they're practically attached to, right? I know I always have my cell phone. I always know where it is. It's on me right now. And if I don't know where it is, I can use my watch to ping it and go find it. And what we did is we actually looked around and we found a study by App Annie on the surge of mobile application popularity throughout the pandemic, throughout these shutdowns. And you can see some pretty interesting numbers here on this slide. We see that consumers downloaded nearly 35 billion new applications in the second quarter of 2020. And at the same time, mobile app usage grew 40% year over year in the second quarter of 2020, and even hit an all-time high of over 200 billion hours during the month of April, which is unreal. And a lot of these popular categories outside games, of course, were business, health and fitness, education, shopping. These are the categories that experienced some significant growth which are ones that we would probably expect considering the topic of having to move to a remote lifestyle, style work from home, shop from home, and so forth. Now, with that being said, you're probably sitting there saying, so what, right? That is nothing novel that I'm saying. That's something that you expected. You're probably not surprised. Maybe you didn't know the exact numbers, but this is probably comes to no news as you. So why am I bringing this up? Why the Inquisition, right? The fact of the matter is society adapted, right? We are incredibly good at adapting to changes. We do it quickly and efficiently. So again, why am I bringing this up? And that's because we very quickly and arguably, sometimes without choice, handed over tons of personal information and security to these mobile applications. And we often did so quite literally with the push of a button, right? I can just go and press a button to download an application. Maybe I have to use my fingerprint, but with that push of a button, we immediately trusted these applications with our personal information. When I say without choice, it's because I have a career, I have to make a living, I have to work to support myself, support my family. If I have to do shopping, I need to shop in order to feed myself. I need to do banking, right? I have things, I have necessities that I need to do. And my only choice was to do it via these mobile applications. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Like I said, there's nothing wrong with adapting. So it's not a terrible thing, but Synopsys, we wanted to take a look at just how much risk we exposed ourselves to as a remote society. We wanted to treat these mobile applications the same way that we would traditionally treat any web or cloud application. So what did we do? We decided to focus our research on mobile applications, Android applications found in the Google Play Store to be more specific. So we analyzed 3,335 of the most popular free and paid applications as ranked by the Google Play Store. We selected from a wide range of categories, 18 categories that experienced significant growth throughout the pandemic. Some of the categories we scanned were top free apps, top grossing apps, games, dating apps, health and fitness, banking. You can see exactly how many applications per category we analyzed right here on this slide. And again, just to underscore this, these are applications from the Google Play Store, the legitimate Google Play Store. I know there are a lot of Android applications you can download from third-party sources, which do come with another unique set of risks. We've gotten that question quite a few times, but no, these are applications found in the Google Play Store. Now, when we were looking at these, what exactly were we looking for? What was our target? And that was really a focus on 3 different types of security issues. So first, there's open source vulnerabilities. So these are known vulnerabilities. Those have been publicly disclosed and responsibly disclosed. You might find them in vulnerability feeds like the National Vulnerability Database, which is, or the NVD, which is the public database of vulnerabilities here in the United States. We also looked for sources of information leakage, and this is potentially harmful information like credentials or API keys that are either intentionally or inadvertently left behind in configuration files and source code. And then we analyzed mobile permissions. So this is the type of access to the mobile device requested by an application in order to get its job done. Now, these aren't all bad. These are very necessary and required in order for an application to do its job, but these can be easily abused and irresponsibly used. So we kind of wanted to analyze that and see what we had there. Now, the only caveat here is we had to look, in order to find all this, we had to look at the Android package or the APK, which is a binary. So how would we go and find all of this information in a file consisting of machine language, right? Not something that you and I can just go look at with our own 2 eyes and parse for information. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Lisa to talk very briefly on how we went about analyzing these applications.
Thanks, Mike. So, as Mike was saying, we have all these APK files. How do we go about analyzing them? And we used a tool called Black Duck Binary Analysis, which is uses a combination of scanning methods to identify open source software within an application, as well as other advanced security features that we'll be talking about as well. With Black Duck binary analysis, we don't need access to the source. All we need is the binary itself. What we do is what the product does is it does not use reverse engineering techniques. It is strictly cracks open the binary and does an interrogation of the information within the binary using a combination of package manager introspection, our own proprietary signature and hash matching, as well as string matching. So we not only look and determine the components, we can also determine the version of the components found mostly through string matching and some proprietary heuristics that we have. We did do a webinar on this called BDBA Binary 101 techniques, or webinar. So that goes into details about really scanning binaries and more details around that. So if you're interested, please feel free to do that. So like I said, we used Black Duck binary analysis to do the identification around the open source components to be able to find the security vulnerabilities, as Mike referred, referenced the NVD from NIST. But there's also, in addition to the security vulnerabilities, these advanced security functionality that we mentioned, that we also focused on, and that Black Duck binary analysis also provides access to. So we had two things. We had mobile permissions and information leakage. So with mobile permissions, we actually did a lot of development around this. When we did this study, we improved upon the mobile permissions that we did by not only exposing what permissions were used, but also categorizing what in what category these mobile permissions are in, based on the information that we got from the Android development kits and whatnot. Basically, we looked at the manifest file and extracted out this information to kind of show where were the risky permissions that you should be aware of. The other thing that we did was we ran the binaries through our information leakage functionality, and what this is basically a wide set of string searches that looks through all the files within a binary, whether it's a binary file or not. We look through and we look for specific patterns and pull out data that could be considered sensitive. So say like unencrypted username that goes with an unencrypted password that goes with a username, or URLs, or say JSON tokens, a whole bunch of different categories, which you'll see a little later. So once we've identified security vulnerabilities, we've also gone through these two other layers of advanced security functionality to really identify the complete risk for an application. Not only the known security vulnerabilities, but also security holes that you may need to be aware of when either distributing your application or using this application you want to be aware of. Next slide. Over to you, Mike.
Very good. Thanks, Lisa. We'll be right back with Lisa. But first, we wanted to dive down into some open source and known vulnerability findings. So this is the findings part of the webinar. I'm sure what everybody's been waiting for. Now, I can't get into the findings without pointing out our findings of the absolute prevalence and ubiquity of open source in today's applications. And we found in all of the applications that we analyzed, 98% of them contained open source components, right? And we at Synopsys publish another report on an annual basis called the Open Source Security or Risk Analysis Report, or the OSRA report, which analyzes other types of applications, web applications, cloud apps, and so on. And we find a similar number. So the main reason I want to point this out is because mobile applications most certainly are not exempt from ubiquity of open source, right? Open source has tons of benefits, from cost effectiveness to a faster time to market, the leveraging of community support, the leveraging of experience you might not necessarily have in-house, right? I could go on and on and on about the benefits of open source, but the caveat is it needs to be tracked and managed different than software that you might purchase from a vendor or commercial off-the-shelf software, right? The type of software where the vendor is responsible for patching and keeping it up to date and staying on top of security issues and vulnerabilities. With open source, it's the consumer of the software who's responsible, and the onus is on them to manage and track this. Now, without managing and tracking this, you can lead to security issues, and one of those security issues is open source vulnerabilities. So here's what we found. So out of those 3,335 applications scanned, we found that 2,115 of those applications contain vulnerabilities. That is 63% of the apps scanned. We found 3,317 vulnerabilities, unique vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities actually occurred over 82,000 different times. 73% of the vulnerabilities we found were older than 2 years, which is a concern because older vulnerabilities have a bigger chance of being exploited. And we also broke this down into a category breakout, right? So what do the vulnerabilities look like when we're looking at them per category? Well, the first thing that you can see here is that vulnerabilities existed in every single category scanned. There's no category that was exempt to open source vulnerabilities. I think some of our most troubling findings were the volume of vulnerabilities found in financial, gaming, and productivity apps. And when I say productivity, I mean apps like spreadsheets and documentation, apps that might just support you in your daily work life. And all of these troubling applications, they gained immense popularity throughout the pandemic for obvious reasons. So if I break down the numbers for a few of our more troubling categories, like banking, where we scanned 107 applications, we found just over 5,000 vulnerabilities. Games, we scanned 257 apps and found about 10,500 vulnerabilities. In productivity, 158 apps scanned and found just under 5,000 vulnerabilities. But what about the types of vulnerabilities? So at Synopsys, we talk a lot about how every vulnerability doesn't pose the same amount of risk. You could have a vulnerability that's not exploitable, a vulnerability that's fixable, or a vulnerability that's not even reachable by your application, right? Just because you pulled in the whole library doesn't mean you're calling all of its code. It doesn't mean that a user can find their way or find some input to this vulnerability. Right, so different vulnerabilities are going to pose a different amount of risk. It'd be unreasonable to say that they're all top priority because it's almost impossible to triage and fix them all, especially considering the volume of vulnerabilities that are disclosed on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. So we dove a little bit deeper, right? Now, I'm going to repeat a couple numbers here just to make a point. So out of the 3,335 apps scanned, there was 2,115 that contained vulnerabilities. Now this comes out to 3,137 unique vulnerabilities appearing over 82,000 times. As I mentioned, that's actually an average of 39 vulnerabilities per vulnerable application. Now, 73% of these vulnerabilities were disclosed over 2 years ago. As I mentioned, that's a little bit concerning, but there's another reason why we bring that up, and that's because 852 of these vulnerabilities were disclosed from 2018 to present. And what is the significance of 2018? Well, that is when the Synopsys Cybersecurity Research Center started issuing Black Duck security advisories, or BDSAs, which are just profiling vulnerabilities that exist inside of our customers' bills of materials. So from 2018 to 2021, we have 852 vulnerabilities that we found. And for those 852 vulnerabilities, there are 782 for which we have a BDSA record. The remaining vulnerabilities that we don't have a BDSA record for are either not open source vulnerabilities or they have a rejected CVE ID. So with this 782, which we believe is an accurate sample size to represent the vulnerabilities that we found, we were able to classify these vulnerabilities a little bit further using Black Duck security advisories. And this is what that looked like. Now, this slide is a bit of an eye chart, I can admit that. So I want to start with a couple definitions of what you might see on this slide, maybe while you're digesting it a little bit. You see POC, this is a proof of concept. It's a type of exploit. It's a script, file, or a piece of code that can be used to reproduce a vulnerability, but it's going to require modification from a skilled attacker to be used against a target in a real world scenario. Then you have an exploit. This is similar to a POC, but this can be used in a cyber attack with little or no modification. And then finally, you have an RCE. This stands for remote code execution, and this refers to a remote attacker executing code directly on the targeted system. And this is considered to be the most critical vulnerability. Either way, a POC, exploit, RCE, these represent exploitable vulnerabilities. So when you see exploitable, this is what we're talking about, an exploitable vulnerability, and these represent the low-hanging fruit for attackers. Now you can see on our figures, our numbers on the right here, there's 42.84% that are associated, vulnerabilities that are associated with a POC or exploit. Now the good news is, if you look at the number above that, around 95% of these do have a fix available, because that number up there are those with no fix available. So most do have a fix available, so they can be patched. I mean, this begs the question why they haven't been patched yet, but I could speculate, but we're going to try to keep it based on facts here. But that is some good news. Now, if we actually use this exploitability lens or metric to look at a couple of these vulnerabilities as they relate to categories, we have some interesting findings. So you see banking appearing a couple times here. You see it's a top 3 most fixable and non-fixable vulnerabilities, as well as in the top 3 most vulnerable application percentages. You see education applications pop up in most vulnerabilities with fixable exploitable vulnerabilities, and then games, right? You see games popping up here, most vulnerabilities and most unfixable vulnerabilities as well. So again, this was just another way of taking a look at all the vulnerabilities that we found and focusing more on the ones that pose the most risk. So the categories you see here are the ones that do contain vulnerabilities that are considered the most risky, the low-hanging fruit for attackers. Now, as we've mentioned a couple times here, known vulnerabilities are not the only security concerns that you have to be worried about as a software organization or even a consumer. And this is where I'm actually going to hand it back over to Lisa to talk about a few other areas of security concerns.
Thanks, Mike. So along with the research that we did, as I mentioned, beyond the security vulnerabilities that Mike just went through, we analyzed 2 different areas. Information leakage, which kind of is we've categorized here our findings around based on those 3,000 plus applications that we were looking at, and broke down what kind of security risks beyond known vulnerabilities we were seeing. So as you can see here, there, we've broken out basically passwords, tokens, keys as one section, as well as email addresses, suspicious URLs, and IP addresses. So the question is, okay, so I now know I've got these vulnerabilities, and now I know that there are these possible security holes. Which one should I be more concerned with, and what can I do about it? So the first thing is you always want to know about it so that you can take some sort of action on it, whether you are a producer of the information or the application or your consumer. If you're a producer, hopefully you can change your developers' habits and enforce certain sets of standards that account for taking some of the sensitive information or looking for the sensitive information before you ship your device out to your consumers. Vice versa, if you're a consumer, hopefully you can work with the producer and have them up their standards to reduce this access. So when we're looking at things like passwords, tokens, and keys, these are areas where you could gain access, a bad actor could gain access to your accounts and systems. And so it's important to make sure that they're encrypted or even removed completely. So for example, JSON web tokens are a way in which you can pass information between parties in a secure method, as long as the information is encrypted. Now, often they are not. Like I said, the JWT requires a digital signed secret key and essentially acts as credentials, and should usually not be kept any longer than absolute necessary. You want to remove it. So in some cases, if this is left behind, these can be easily decoded and reveal information that helps an attacker exploit the application. And with regards to this, the research we did, our CERC team found that there were some JWTs in banking applications. They found about 4 that could be exploited, and there were 3 in budgeting apps that could have been exploited. So this is something that you should be aware of, and if you are a producer, put in a step to like make sure that this information is called out before the application is sent into production. You might look at things like emails and go, this is how risky are email addresses. And I think, as we all know, that email addresses, if you're leaving in private company email addresses, it leaves you open to phishing attacks and other types of email scams. It discloses internal domains and also usernames that a hacker could use as a point of entry into your system, where you can lose IP or run into other security issues that is going to cost your company money. So it's important to even if you think, what can an email address do, you need to be aware of what they could do and to call these out of your applications as you go out. As well as you'll see that we have less around the suspicious IP addresses and URLs, which is good to see. But these are really kind of some of your higher risk things. In that leaving in a suspicious URL, if a user clicks on it, they could be downloading malware or bots. It could serve up inappropriate information in some cases. That say if it was an educational tool. And it went to a site that is not good for young children to view. You want to be aware of some of these things, as well as URLs could also disclose private APIs, which once again could be used for getting into your systems and having a bad actor cause security issues that way as well. Next slide. So that was kind of some of the information we found through our information leakage functionality within the Black Duck binary analysis tool. The other piece that we worked on and actually improved during this research study was looking at permissions. What permissions applications were asking for, and what types of applications were asking for those permissions, and what is the average that we were seeing. So if you look at this graph here, you'll see that in general we were seeing about 18 permissions overall was the average. So anything over that, you start wondering, why does this application require so many permissions, and what type of permissions are they asking for in that case? As you notice, for anybody over the 18, one of the highest categories was using permissions that are not for third-party use. And we're going to go into a little bit more about what that means in the next couple of slides. But in general, we are seeing budgeting, payment apps, and banking apps have a lot of permissions. And the question is, do those apps really need all those permissions? Is the question. And once we take a little deeper dive into what those permissions are, I think you'll see that probably they don't need them. The other thing is around sensitive permissions, looking at what apps are requiring a lot of sensitive permissions, and the question is, do they really need those permissions? So looking at top grossing dating apps, health and fitness apps, top free dating apps. That's a lot of sensitive information for a dating app. I don't know if I want somebody knowing all that information about me. As well as food and drink apps. What kind of sensitive information are they being do they require? I'm assuming they probably need your address, probably payment information. If these applications are requesting these permissions, and also on top of that have security vulnerabilities, in a combination, this could be a very risky application to use, especially if they're not addressing security vulnerabilities and have other security holes that could give a hacker access to your private information or even your whole mobile phone in general. So like I said, this is kind of an overall view, and we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive in the next couple of slides as to how these permissions affect these mobile applications and what they look like. So taking a deeper dive here. Before we kind of go into it, I want to kind of just go through a quick explanation of what factory test permissions are, and call privilege and process outgrowing and Bluetooth privilege. So factory test permissions basically give an application the ability to run as a root user. When you give the application access to the entire, it gives the application access to the entire phone. The permission also requires the ability to read the logs, and enables the application to read system logs, which could have user private information. These types of permissions should never be used by third-party apps. It's really used only for the mobile operating system and should not be used by the application. So when you see any of these applications using factory test apps, the question is, why are they there? Usually it is there, they might be there because a developer made a mistake, say while they were doing some testing or whatnot, they were using this, or the other thing is that it's actually there for malicious or suspicious behavior. And I would question the mobile application and why it's using that. Many of the permissions that are used for can you go back? I haven't finished. Many of the applications that are using factory testing, there are other permissions that could be used for alternative purposes that are non-invasive for users. Going through call privilege. The call privilege is a permission enabled for an application to call any phone number, including emergency numbers, without having to go through the phone's dialer or require the phone owner to confirm the call. So this could be, pretty costly if somebody got a hold of this permission and started making international phone calls through your mobile application, your mobile phone. It's not necessary for an application to require this permission in order to achieve its desired functionality. There are other permissions that could be used that are not as risky as this. So definitely don't want to see applications using this. The other another permission, processing outgoing calls, is a permission to allow the app to see numbers dialed in outgoing calls with the option to redirect calls. So that one is definitely kind of a bit of a risky one to see. Why would somebody want to be looking at your outgoing calls? And the concept of somebody redirecting a call that comes into you to somewhere else is a bit scary. We actually found this in a health and fitness app, and I find it hard to believe why a health and fitness app would require this permission. The final one here, one of the riskier ones, is a Bluetooth privilege, and this is a permission that allows an application to pair Bluetooth devices without any user interaction, and allows access to contacts and message access. So once again, this is a permission that could, actually go beyond just your mobile application and give access to Bluetooth devices within your mobile app, your mobile or your phone or your tablet. So definitely have to be careful of those. So these are our riskiest permissions that we came out with. So these on the left are some of the information or applications where we found to be the riskiest. The categories with the highest percentage of outliers: tools for teachers, health and fitness, and the top grossing dating apps, and educational. So I'm kind of surprised at how many educational tools would have access to these permissions that don't seem applicable. On top of that, once again, this is bringing up what we saw on the last slide. We're seeing budgeting, payment, and banking with the most permissions per app. So once again, the question is, why do we need so many permissions for these apps, especially if we're exposing sensitive information? And like I said, some of these applications were found to be using these permissions that I've just described on the right here that are considered the riskiest in the permission group that we were looking at. Next slide, please. So we wanted to highlight a couple of excessive permissions examples. The first one was one for tools for teachers, education app. And so it was one application that was downloaded over 1 million times. It had less than, it had 11 permissions. It requires 11 permissions, and that Google classified as protective level dangerous. So it had about 32 permissions total, but 11 of the permissions were considered dangerous. At runtime, the permissions would allow access to the restricted data and perform restricted actions. And it was basically allowing access to private or sensitive user data. And one of those things was around the location of the user who was using the app, which if a user was using it around children, was basically showing where you could find children. There is the ability to have access to find location versus, say, cursor level location access, and this was using the find level location access, so it was like very pinpointed. Not necessarily something you really want to have when dealing with children. Being able to have somebody access an application that could pinpoint their location. The biggest offender we found in our research was around a health and fitness app. It was downloaded over 5 million times, had 57 permissions, required 56 permissions. 31 were classified as dangerous, and used signature permission not to be used by third-party apps. So it was using these factories test permissions as well. So the question is, why was this factory test information or permissions left in? This is, of course, allows the application to run as root user, accessing the entire phone, which is very risky. So either the Android application was poorly designed and the developer left the permissions in by accident, or potentially there was a bad actor behind the application and was looking to take advantage of any sensitive and private data that was for this application. We're hoping it's just a oversight, but this is something that should be considered when you're looking at using a mobile app, what permissions are being used. So those are a couple examples. Next slide. So, we've kind of gone through a whole bunch of information around, security vulnerabilities and looking at, specifically the mobile applications. In summary, what have we learned here? That definitely open source is used in every facet of software development. We definitely seen this in mobile applications, as well as, web and cloud applications. That their open source vulnerabilities in mobile applications are just as pervasive as we see in cloud and native web applications. And we need to pay attention to them and triage them appropriately as they are found. That the organizations need to also pay attention to the mobile applications that they produce, just like they do for their cloud and web applications, and identify and remediate the vulnerabilities. In addition, we should be also paying attention to security holes and security attack surfaces beyond just a standard security vulnerability that will leak sensitive and personal information of our users, and identify and evaluate them, and of course address them. And then finally, specifically, if you're producing mobile applications, really focus on what permissions are really required for the application, making sure that you're not including those factory test permissions, because having more permissions is not better. It only creates more questions than answers when we're dealing with mobile applications. So if you guys have questions about any of the content that we kind of went over, please feel free to reach out to myself, Lisa Brinkleson, or to Mike Mcguire about any of the information that you've seen in today's webinar. We have some related assets for you as well that kind of build on top of this report, this webinar that we did, and encourage you to take a look if you're interested in doing deeper dives on any of the topics that we kind of talked about here as well. And on top of that, we are, what I thought I'd do is go through a couple of frequently asked questions that we've gotten in relation to this research that we have done around binaries specifically. So a couple of questions that I've gotten after kind of talking about the research that we did were what part of the SDLC is best for scanning binaries? So whether it's a mobile app or a binary, when is it best to introduce that into the SDLC? Some of it depends on how you're getting your binaries. So if you're producing the binaries, usually you want to do scanning before you actually send the binary out into production. Make sure that some of the information that we've talked about is not included, and that you're addressing any security vulnerabilities, especially high-end criticals, before it's being shipped out the door. So usually we see customers that are producing binaries actually do a final binary scan as before it is being scheduled to go out the door for production. The other way in which we see customers including scanning for binaries in their SDLC is if they are actually the consumer of a binary. So say either they've purchased an application that's in binary form, they don't have access to the source, or they're part of the supply chain and they are getting the binary from a downstream producer for them. And at that point, they will want to scan the binaries when it first comes into their SDLC, their software development lifecycle, to make sure that when they're including it, if they're using it internally or including it within their own application, that they are able to address any security concerns before they get too far down into the production line there. So that's kind of where we usually see customers scanning for binaries. Another question I get is around, does the standard binary analysis product, Black Duck binary analysis, integrate with most CI/CD tool chains? For Black Duck binary analysis, we have a very robust REST API system, and in most cases, in all cases for our customers, they actually do the integration through the REST API. So, like I said, it's a very easy to use API system instead of APIs, and customers usually do their own custom integration with that. Another question I get a lot is, can you scan encrypted binaries? So that is the one thing that we don't do. Like I said, we don't do any reverse engineering or anything. We cannot scan encrypted binaries. That's one thing that we cannot do. Kind of in conjunction with that, I get questions about, can you scan iOS mobile applications? So for this research, we actually focused on Android applications and what you could get out of the Google Play, App Store, because they do not necessarily encrypt the APKs so that you can scan them. Unlike what you get from the Apple Store, iOS mobile apps are typically encrypted, and we can't directly scan them from the App Store. In those cases, we've directly worked with, say, the producers of the mobile apps to be able to get access to an unencrypted Apple iOS application to be able to scan them. And those are kind of the main questions I get around, mobile applications and permissions and scanning binaries. But if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Really, thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to turn it back over to DZone. Thank you.
All right, and with that, DZone would like to thank Lisa and Mike for a great presentation. DZone would also like to thank Synopsys for providing the audience with a great webinar. Lastly, thank you to everyone who tuned in. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career.